Moenu v'Rabbeinu.
How are you, Amos?
I'm doing well. How are you, Rabbi Tal?
I am really, really good. I'm also very excited for the first of hopefully many episodes of this podcast that we have, Everything Under the Sun.
Yes.
And thank you very much for initiating that. And why don't you tell everybody on YouTube and through all the mediums that are going to be watching this what this podcast is all about.
So this podcast is called Everything Under the Sun. It's a Jewish perspective on everyday life. We are going to talk about everything under the sun.
Yeah, quite literally. I mean, we have a list of topics, about like 20 topics that we've kind of rifled off just between us, Amos and I. And we also would appreciate anybody who wants to hear about what Judaism, or Jewish perspective at least, on everyday life, on topics that you like. You can put it in the comments section.
Yeah, and the idea is that we have fun. It doesn't all have to be related to Torah or all related to things that are in certain books. It can be anything. So we're going from cricket versus baseball to more serious topics like today's topic,
which is the referendum in New Zealand, mainly talking about the concept of euthanasia, the specific law in New Zealand, and possibly touching at the end of the podcast on recreational marijuana and the cannabis referendum. But first, let's introduce ourselves. So, my name is Ariel Tal. I'm the rabbi here at the Wellington Jewish Community Center in Wellington, New Zealand. Is the capital. And by the way, Wellington is a much cooler city than Auckland. So I just want to put that out there. Since it is our podcast, it's also the capital city. Most people know about New Zealand know that there's like 50 million sheep and like 5 people. The reality is that there are many sheep. There's closer to 30 million sheep now. There's 30 million sheep, and there's 5 million people, not 5 people, as opposed to what people think. And the main city is Auckland, but the capital city is Wellington. It is my privilege here to be with my wife, my 4 daughters, and our dog Muksa, to be here as the rabbi, and my wife is the rebbitzin in the Wellington Jewish Community Center, formerly known as the Wellington Hebrew Congregation, now for the past 2 years, since October 2018. And now to you, Amos, a little bit about yourself.
And I've been here since 2005. My parents and I moved here from Israel. I'm here with my whole family, my whole direct family. I've got a background in media production, so this is how I come up with weird ideas like having this podcast. And yeah, I just really like to make things and experiment with things to make cool to me. In terms of Jewish life, I've been born and raised Jewish in Israel, and it's interesting because I've only really been very into my Jewish life since moving to New Zealand, and obviously as I grew up to an adult, I developed more and more of a connection to my Jewish life. So it would be a learning experience for me, this podcast, as well as hopefully all of you listening as well. So let's explore and have some fun.
Yeah, I have a Canadian and Israeli background. Amos has an Indian and Israeli background, and of course has been in New Zealand for the past 15 years. So this should be interesting mix of all hemispheres of 3 different continents, and away we go. So today's subject is, we're going to start with a very serious subject. For those of you who are listening in New Zealand, you must be very aware and possibly have already voted on the referendum, as the voting is open already. And it is, there's every couple of years there's a referendum which gives the people a voice for government policy. The government puts out policies, and people can vote if they want to adopt it or not. Regardless of their party, regardless of who's in government and who's in power. At least that's my understanding of it.
Correct.
And one of the main subjects on the table right now is the whole concept of euthanasia. Euthanasia as opposed to what I thought when I was 14. 14, I thought it stood for 3 words, youth in Asia, and I had to debate it. This just start with a little bit of a light topic. I had to debate it in my debating class, and I was like, why do people want to kill youth in Asia? And what did they do wrong? And why are we debating this? They should all live. And then somebody told me what euthanasia actually is, that it's a word and it starts with an E. And mercy killing. So all the youth in Asia should be fine, should be well, please God. And we wish everybody well, the youth in Asia, the youth around the world. However, when it comes to ending somebody's life who's terminal, it is a huge debate for years now, for tens of years, around the world, and now specifically in New Zealand, there's a vote. And the vote is specifically around the law. So do you know a little bit more about the law?
I've heard a lot about the law. I don't know a whole lot about it.
So let me give you some of the details here.
Some of you might know about through YouTube. I've seen a lot about this euthanasia bill through YouTube. I get a lot of advertisements saying yes or no, and a lot of people seem to be quite outspoken about it. But
everybody has an opinion about this.
Everybody has an opinion,
and it is a very complex opinion. It is officially called the End of Life Choice Referendum. That's assuming a lot of things. I want to say off the bat, because every name, every title is bias. I mean, you just can't help it by being biased, because when you put a title, it's bias. Bias, correct. I'm not saying that even as a criticism. It's just a fact. So the fact that you have an end-of-life choice means that the presumption is that people could choose to end their own life.
Yes.
That's the presumption.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to debate that presumption here, if that is, in fact, a choice.
Are we going to debate it?
Well, we'll find out. I'm not sure. Well, we're gonna. At least I'm gonna debate it. In my personal opinion,
I think our opinion is pretty similar in this regard.
In this case, but we'll try to represent both opinions, and I'll tell you my opinion, and Amos will tell you his opinion.
Just as a future note, not everything is we're not gonna agree on everything, obviously, because we are our own people. And we live our own separate lives. Absolutely.
So let me just read who would be eligible for assisted dying. It's really complicated. It does break down to simple things. It would be up to the person and their medical professional, meaning a doctor, who would give recommendation and who would administer the lethal drug to essentially kill a person at their own choice. But, of course, not every person would be eligible for this. And again, even saying eligible means that it's legitimate, and we're going to debate that if this is legitimate or not. But this is what it says. To be able, I'm reading it from the referendums.govt.nz website, meaning it's a New Zealand government website. So this is completely neutral, meaning this is just what it is, and you can vote yes or no on this. Who would be eligible for assisted dying? To be able to ask for assisted dying, a person must meet all, not some, but all of the following criteria. 1, they have to be 18 years or over. B, they have to be a citizen or permanent resident of New Zealand. You can't be a visitor. You can't be on a visa like myself or anybody else. C, this is really important, suffer from a terminal illness that is likely is a key word here, because we're going to debate this, likely to end their life within 6 months. I have to say on this point, before I read the rest of the things, my father, and he may listen to this podcast, Dr. David Tal, may live and be well for many, many years. He is a geriatric doctor. He's 67, and almost 67, and he's he deals with end of life situations all the time. And one thing, after being in this specific profession for like at least 35 years, possibly a little bit more at this point, he says that you can never, ever, ever, ever predict when a person's going to die. You just don't know. Doctors make predictions.
I fully agree with that.
And there is no guarantee. It's not like milk. Milk, when it expires.
Roughly.
Even then, it could be off for a day or two, right? But, it's not like milk where you're like, okay, it's like 3 weeks past its expiry date, it's bad. Chuck it out.
Yep.
You don't, it's not, people are not like milk, as a very, very loose and slightly coarse analogy. So,
it'd be interesting if in life, in Hebrew we say Admer Ve'esrim.
Yeah.
Till 120. 120.
Well, that's what Rabbi Sachs says. Lord Jonathan Sachs says his grandmother said you should live till 120 in 3 months. So like, why 3 months? So she's like, look, so you don't die right away.
That's right. It's whether you're 120 or any other age, it's probably not the best time to die.
The point is that saying that somebody's likely to end their life within 6 months is really presumptuous and nobody really knows.
Correct.
So the fact that the website says that, in my opinion, this is only my opinion, highly problematic, because even if a doctor can look you straight in the eye and says you have 6 months to live, they can be BSing you and you don't know it. Or not necessarily intentionally, I'm saying even unintentionally. They just don't know. Not that doctors don't want to end people's lives. This is not a criticism on doctors or anybody in the medical profession. It's just that they don't know. Okay. 3 more criteria. 4, have significant and ongoing decline in physical capability. Again, this is really subjective, but that's what it says. 5, experience unbearable suffering that cannot be eased. That is clearly subjective and something we're going to have to address because that is the main issue. The main issue here is not death. The main issue here, in my opinion, is suffering and putting someone out of their misery. And 6, to be able to make an informed decision about assisted dying. I'm going to argue that nobody's able to make that decision. That is going to be my argument. My main argument, making an informed decision to kill yourself is in fact suicide, and that's what we're going to discuss. So, and there's a lot of procedures about this, how the choice is made freely. There's a whole process, selecting the method and timing, who does it, how you administer the medical dose, and you can look it up on the referendums.govt.nz website. I don't really want to get into necessarily the political discussion at this point. People will vote how they vote. I obviously have an opinion, so does Amos, how people should vote, which we'll express. But I really want to talk about the concept of it. And as this podcast is, it's a Jewish perspective on everyday life. So what is the Jewish perspective on this referendum? So let's start with Amos. Like, what's your take on this whole thing? What's your gut reaction? And after thinking about it, what's your real take on it?
In terms of a gut reaction, I've spent a lot of time with cancer patients in the past 6 or so years, and there is a lot of suffering, but it's always on a patient-based scale, from what I gather. So the doctor will come in and ask the patient, how are you doing today? Is there any pains, aches, blah, blah, blah. And they'll ask them, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is it?
Okay.
Subjective, correct?
Absolutely.
My take on it, and my faith, and my understanding of the faith as well, is that I don't agree with someone else dictating whether I'm suffering or not, whether I should end my life in that term.
Why not, though?
Roughly. Why not? I think it feels like giving up. And I think giving up is, while you're going through a hard time, giving up is not the way to do it. Everyone goes through hard times.
Right.
Sometimes you do have the choice to give up. And this is a time when I think that the choice to give up should not be offered. Because I think a lot of times people need to go through that suffering, as we were talking about suffering, in order to go through that growth, whether it is directly happening to them or whether it's happening to someone that they very, very much care about, or a loved one, so on and so forth.
Right.
But that's my perspective on it.
That's an interesting perspective, because let's just take that point for a moment before we get into like Torah sources about this and Jewish sources about this. The whole concept of giving up. This is like, it's actually a point I wanted to make in like 10 minutes from now. But since you brought it up,
let's make it now, because no time like the present.
No time like the present, absolutely. So the question, let's say, and let's just assume that somebody would vote that this passed. Let's assume that this passed, for argument's sake, right? And basically what it means, that as we specified, there's a terminal illness, and terminal illnesses usually is accurate. It's usually
correct.
Accurate.
Yep.
Meaning a terminal illness could go on for 10 years, but like leukemia, like we know somebody, we won't specify who, but we know somebody who is suffering from leukemia.
Yeah.
And they're on trial drugs, and thank God they're still alive, doing well. They celebrated a celebration recently, a double celebration, in fact. I won't say what, because I don't want to say who it is. And it's unbelievable. And this person hopefully will live. Mamash, ad mea v'esrim. He could. It's probably unlikely based on the medical science, but you never, ever know. This person should have, medically speaking, should have probably already, chas v'shalom, not been with us.
Correct.
But thank God, and he is, and he should be with us for many, many more years. Him, and his family, and see his kid grow up, and the whole bit. So the point is, outside of that, when I deal with people in death and dying situations, as a rabbi, if somebody has a terminal illness, it's usually terminal. Usually. And it's usually within more or less a time frame the doctors say, even though you can't predict 6 months, it could go on for longer or less time. So let's say a person actually has terminal illness, they claim they're suffering, and I'm not going to take that feeling or that opinion away from anybody. It is not for me to dictate if somebody is suffering or not. It is completely subjective. And we do have to take people at their word if they're authentic about it, which I'll question in a minute. But I generally think that people are authentic about it, and we should believe them and take them at their word. We shouldn't say, "Oh, you're not suffering." No, you have no idea if a person's suffering or not.
Yes.
The point, though, is, let's say we said, "Okay, so Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so, you're suffering too much. I can't take it anymore. I'd rather die." Okay, we can do that. Here's the procedure. Sign off. Family signs off or not, which is a whole other issue. But let's say the family is supportive, because that's a whole other topic that we may breach. But let's say the family is supportive, and the person says, "I end their life." And the doctor and nurse says, "Here's the act. We can do it legally." They do it legally, and the person effectively is killed before they were naturally going to die. That's what it is. And they put them out of their suffering. And the family says, thank God they're out of their suffering. Where do you draw the line? Because the person gave up. What the person did is they gave up on their life.
Correct.
That is what they did. We're saying, though, it's legitimate to give up on your life if this passes, because we want to alleviate the suffering. The only thing, well, maybe there's two things, but one of the things is the suffering. Another thing is the burden on the family, which is a different issue, and possibly the financial burden on the family, which is also an unrelated issue to suffering.
Let's touch on that briefly. Because
I want to go back to suffering first.
Okay.
So suffering.
Yeah, I'll hold it.
The question is, and then we'll get back to that topic.
Yeah.
Suffering is very subjective, and who says if this passes that we're only going to limit the law to this? What if someone is under so much debt they'd rather take their own life? What if someone is physically abused by a spouse or somebody else was sexually abused, they can't live with themselves anymore. Now, these are real things. And they'd rather put themselves out of the pain, but they're not terminally ill. Like, at what point do we take someone's life? Or do we not take someone's life? As we said, you can be terminally ill, and you don't know if you have 6 months. You could live for 20 years.
Yes. And there are cases like that.
And we know cases like that. And there are many cases like that. And there's nobody's a prophet. Nobody knows how to predict these things. And where does it end? My feeling is, this is my gut, but it's also, I think, based on general psychology. Once you open this Pandora's box, there's no end to it. The fact is, we have suicide hotlines in New Zealand and around the world.
Yeah.
And the purpose of suicide hotlines is to stop people from committing suicide. Now, anybody will talk about suicide, which you would think is a different topic, but it's really not. It's exactly the same thing. Because why do people commit suicide? People naturally want to live. A fight or flight is a real reaction that people have, and it is a natural reaction. It's how we're hardwired. Everybody's hardwired like that. And people do commit suicide, unfortunately. Why do they commit suicide? Many reasons. Mostly because they are suffering, because they're in pain. And suicide is a way to alleviate the pain. It is exactly the same thing. You open that door to all suicides, because you can say, who says that terminally ill is different than a person who wakes up in a cold sweat, has nightmares, and thinks that people are going to rape them every day? Which is a horrible situation, right? Or someone that's in debt and says, I don't know how I'm going to survive tomorrow. I don't know how I'm going to feed my family. I might as well kill myself. And there are lots of cases like that around the world and in New Zealand also, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And that is the number one, in my opinion, before even getting into Jewish sources, that's the number one problem with this bill.
I agree with that. Not directly, but I agree with a lot of what you're saying in that sense. We were going to touch on the financial side, was it?
Yeah. The financial burden and the burden on the family. So go ahead.
So burden on the family. What's there to say that a family won't necessarily suffer the burden if they do go through with the assisted alleviation of the suffering, or the euthanasia of a loved one? Because I think it's gonna bear on them regardless of whether they're ending the person's suffering. It's not gonna end their suffering as such. It might end the person's suffering, but their own burden on their own head might not be alleviated. Do you get what I'm saying?
Well, it is a choice. It's because it's a choice.
Exactly, though. It's a choice.
You made that choice.
Who makes the choice?
And you literally kill. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Are you allowed to make the choice? But let's say you're allowed to make the choice.
You're allowed to make the choice.
So you basically said, I'm going to kill this person, and that's legitimate. You have to live with that for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And as you're saying,
that's a big weight to live with.
That is a huge weight.
It's massive.
And you can't take it back.
No.
Just like killing somebody. It is killing
exactly.
somebody. We're saying it's legitimate to kill a person now. You know, there's cases where it's legitimate to kill a person, like in war, as an act of self-defense. In other cases, right?
Yeah.
Even in Jewish law. So killing is not necessarily murder. And this is trying to draw a line between killing and murder. So I do appreciate that there is a difference between killing and murder. Murder is forbidden, always. Killing is something that we are permitted to do in certain circumstances. And this is trying to expound the boundary to here, even though this person is not a threat to anyone, and it's not during war. It's not a threat to the family. Another case which we won't discuss now is a child and a mother who's giving birth to a child, and the child is endangering the mother.
Yeah.
Are you allowed to kill the child to save the mother? Basically, the Judaism says you save the mother. That's the bottom line. We won't get into that whole debate because
that's a whole different debate.
It is, but I'm saying
as you say, it's a different sugya.
It is, but the reason I mention it is because it's the closest thing to this bill.
Yes, correct.
Because, but the difference is that one person, in this case, a baby that is about to be born, which is a person in Judaism, but also not fully breathing in the outside world yet, still in utero, is actually threatening the life of the mother. So there's an actual threat to a life. And there's almost no difference, I say almost to be careful, between that and someone putting a gun to your head saying, "I'm going to kill you," that you're allowed to kill that person in self-defense. So obviously there's a difference because one's a baby and one is a person with choice. But as conceptually, as far as killing, you are legitimately killing somebody because that's a life. Life is full of obstacles, and there are times where you're allowed to kill. As King Solomon says in Kohelet that we're about to read, there's time to kill.
Yeah.
There is. There is a time to kill.
There is.
But there is never a time to murder. And the question is this murder or is this killing? It's framed as mercy killing. It's framed really nicely. A free choice and all of that stuff. I think that is completely bogus. Nobody has a free choice of their own life. But now we're on the subject. We talked about suffering a little bit. Now we're talking about burden.
Just going back a second, we're not condoning the killing and or murder of anyone.
Right.
YouTube.
That's correct. That's correct. We're talking about this as a concept, as a bill.
Yes.
We're
talking about the concept of the difference between killing and or murder.
That's correct. That's correct.
Not as condoning either, or so on and so forth.
That's correct.
As we were.
But it's a very important distinction between killing and murder in Judaism. One's permitted and one's not permitted, and that's the difference. Okay. Getting back to, is this so families will claim, and I've seen some of the ads, which are incredibly emotional and tug at your heart.
Yeah.
And you see this person saying, "I don't want to be a burden on my family. I feel like my family is just watching over me." There is a truth to that, because after going through this with all four of my grandparents and seeing what my parents went through, for all four of them, each one is a different case, and I won't get into any of them, but their life was, at some point, they were just about to die. They were waiting to die. They all died of natural causes. Some earlier than others. Some lost their life in more tragic ways than others to disease. But my grandmother, even though she died last year, she was 94. She had lived a really, really good life. But basically, for the last 2 years of her life, you're basically watching her slowly deteriorate, and eventually die. And in a lot of cases, with my own family and with community members, you are sad, but you're not happy, but you're relieved. There's a sense of relief that the person is no longer suffering.
Yes.
And no longer also, it could be a burden. I remember what my parents went through. They were in Toronto, and my grandmother was in Florida, and they had to go back and forth, and they had to travel. It's not even about the money or the time, but the emotional burden that it took upon them was tremendous. Does that legitimately give you a legitimate claim to administer lethal drugs to someone? So the Jewish answer is absolutely not. No way. But it is a legitimate thing that there is a burden on a family, and the real question is how to support people through that, how to help them get through the burden, and is that something that can possibly be a good thing on some level. But that is one of the claims for euthanasia, to enable it, because it shouldn't be a burden on a family, and especially if it's a financial burden, and you have the main supporter and the person can't move on because they can't move on from the main supporter. They can't get remarried, right? Let's say, or if the person is young, or they have to spend a lot of their resources, money, and time in taking care of that person and have to stop work themselves. Then it becomes a financial burden as well. And that's also one of the claims. And people are like, you know what? I'm going to die anyways. Just kill me now. So what do you say to that?
So something I'm thinking about is actually a few minutes ago we touched on the topic of murder versus killing.
Killing, yeah.
Would we be calling this a murder then, according to the Torah?
Yeah, this would be that's going to be my claim. This is murder, and therefore you have to say no to it.
Yes. So, I mean, that for me that confirms my thoughts and my position on the issue. Is it 100% black and white? No, but
no, it's not.
No issue is. This is why there's a debate here, and why it's you could argue either side, not from the side of Torah, but from personal sentiments, people can argue either. In the touching on suffering now, I still think that suffering is going to happen regardless of whether someone goes through the action or not. All that's going to happen is the suffering is going to be shifted from one person to another party, and whether that's the family or one particular person or the doctor, even the doctor might the doctor
Maybe.
that needs to be consulted.
Maybe.
We don't know how much of a burden that's going to be on the doctors.
Yeah, but I don't think that's a factor.
Why not?
Honestly. Because because that's they're just doing their job professionally. I mean, yes, they are a person, but when you deal with it professionally, then just like a defense lawyer can represent a murderer and they have to defend them if that's their job. Let's say they're the DA, right? District attorney, right? They have to defend them. That's their job. They may not like the person. They may think they're wrong. I mean, that's a conundrum of a lawyer, right? You may have to, as a doctor, save a terrorist.
Yeah.
You're in a lot of... So you basically have to put all those moral things aside if it's permitted. And the doctor would not be doing something illegal. The doctor would be doing something that's 100% legal and not their choice. It's the other person's choice. They gave the person the informed choice. And all they're doing is carrying out this other person's wishes. And it's not on the doctor at all. And they're just doing... And they're binded by it. They're binded by it. There's a lot of cases like that professionally. So I really actually don't think the doctor, even though they're people, I don't think that factors into this decision at all. The family does, the person does, and society, but not the doctor. I mean, that's my opinion.
I would somewhat disagree with that.
Why is that?
Because I think the doctor still has to have a moral compass. Therefore, the doctor, while they can make a recommendation one way or the other, it's on them to have a moral compass to say whether I'm prepared to do this or not as well.
Legally, by the way, you're absolutely wrong.
Legally, I am wrong.
Yeah.
But in terms of a moral compass, if the doctor is a human being, 100%, we just said that, right?
Mm-hmm.
They can offer that, but they can't necessarily... It's not to say that won't weigh on there. So say you have a doctor that had bad week, 3 people that are eligible for this bill. For this issue, exactly. That's a lot of life there.
Yeah, let me tell you, I just completely disagree with that. I just dismiss that. I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but I just completely dismiss it. Because, look, I had to do...
It's a perfect example of where we don't necessarily
We
agree.
absolutely disagree on this one, which is fine.
That's okay.
Look, I can tell you, again, without getting into names, at one point in my life, I had to give a eulogy and oversee a funeral for someone with an incredibly questionable background. There are people who did not come to this person's funeral, and people that will never, ever say any good word about this person, and thought that I shouldn't even eulogize them. And I spoke with but I did it because it was my job, as I said, like the defense attorney. And when I consulted a rabbi of mine, he says, you got to give a eulogy. You don't have to say the person's a righteous individual. So I actually wrote a special eulogy for someone with a questionable background, and I have a template for that now. And all I spoke about is man's struggle with life and spiritual and physical. And I didn't say really one good word about the person outside of one or two facts. And I just left it at that. The family was very appreciative because they had no idea I skewed it. And I would, for anybody else, I would have had a much more kind of cheerful or positive, I should say, outlook on their life and my eulogy. And here I didn't. I was like straight. But I did give a eulogy. Even though if I wasn't the rabbi, I may have not even gone to the funeral. Because I may not want to show this person respect. Maybe or maybe not. I don't know what I do. There was also a funeral director that talked about, when I spoke about this specific case, the funeral director, they said there was, without getting into specifics, there was a New Zealand couple, not a Jewish couple, that was a husband murdered his wife and came to the funeral and brought his wife's dead body and said, I want a burial, and I want this, and he had all these demands. And they had a huge problem with it, because they're supporting a murderer who literally murdered his wife. It was under police investigation. But they were legally bound to it. And they had to fulfill all this person's wishes, even though morally they were vehemently against it.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's just the burden of being a professional in this capacity.
Okay, I understand that.
Yeah.
I get that.
Yeah.
Still don't completely agree, but that's okay.
That's good. It's good to disagree, by the way. If we don't disagree at least once during a podcast, it's really bad.
Yeah, it means we're not Jewish enough.
That's right. That's right. So we have to disagree. So as far as what does Jewish law say about this? It's very interesting. You said is it a black and white issue? So I'll tell you where it is, and I'll tell you where it isn't as far as Jewish law. Because it's a Jewish perspective on everyday life, not a general perspective. And right now we've talked about mostly general perspectives, a little bit of Jewish perspective.
And personal feelings as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's important, especially this issue. Lots of feelings come up.
Right.
And I do want to say, first and foremost, I don't want to see people suffer. Nobody believes that people should suffer. And we should do everything within our power without killing them to alleviate suffering. There's no problem taking morphine. There's no, possibly even the second part of this referendum, which you may touch on at the end of this podcast, or do another one about medical marijuana. I think that for specific situations, if somebody's really suffering and they want marijuana medically, not recreationally, then I think it's completely legitimate. I have no problem with that whatsoever. The vote, I believe, is on recreational marijuana, which becomes a huge
Presented
issue.
as such, yeah.
Yes. So I won't get into that right now. But as far as all of those things, even as far as marijuana, which could possibly lead to substance abuse, maybe not, it is something that Judaism and, in fact, kosher agencies would permit and endorse. But killing somebody would not. Barring one situation, which is really, really a gray area of brain death. And that's where you get into the huge halachic debate. But let's start from the beginning. Are you allowed to kill someone? Are you allowed to commit suicide? So there's one case where in Judaism you're allowed to commit suicide. And that's the case of King Saul. King Saul was in a battlefield against the Philistines. And he had lost the kingdom at that point, meaning he was still king. But Samuel basically told him, you will not be king, and your kids will not succeed you, because he lost it, because of things that he did. And you have to read the story to learn more about that. But at the end of Samuel 1, Shmuel Aleph, he goes to war around Megiddo, and he's with his sons, specifically Yonatan among them, who is supposed to succeed him. And he's losing the battle, and the Philistines are going to capture him. Now, if they capture him, they're going to brutally torture him and eventually kill him. But it's going to be brutal, and it's going to be a huge amount of suffering. And again, this is the context of war, meaning he's not suffering from a disease. Somebody's literally going to kill him. Yeah. And not only that, but somebody's going to brutally torture him in the future. So in order to not go through that, in that one specific instance, King Saul, he leaned on his sword and asked the Amalekite, Naar, with him, to push him on his sword, to give him a little push in order to kill him. Now, the whole story, and so halacha says, if you're like, in a case of King Shaul, you're allowed to commit suicide. So that's why maybe, though, if you know the story of Masada, I claim that's probably the only legitimate mass suicide in Jewish history.
Yes.
There was the Josephus conundrum. That's a little bit more complicated because people were killing each other, and Josephus survived in Yodfat after defending the city for 3 months. But now we're getting into history. I don't really want to get into history, but
that's a topic for another day.
It is. But King Shaul is a legitimate case of suicide. However, even in that case, King David killed that Amalekite Naar, the boy who was carrying Shaul's weapons, because he literally killed him. And even in that case, it is a case where you shouldn't kill him. Rabbi Friedler, when he talked about this, he gave a whole East Court drasha about this. Rabbi Friedler is the rabbi of Auckland, the Auckland Hebrew congregation in New Zealand. Rabbi Nati Friedler is a great rabbi, colleague of mine as well. We work together in many capacities here in New Zealand Orthodox Jewry, and he's a great guy, good friend, and he's also a very good rabbi. And one of the things that he talked about was Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion, one of the 10 martyrs that we mentioned on Yom Kippur. He gave this in his Zoom Yom Kippur drasha, and they literally put the Romans, meaning they put like cotton or wool around his heart, and they burned him, and they put wool around his heart so that he'd burn slowly and he'd suffer more. And
it's brutal stuff.
And when it's horrible. Any way that you're killed is a horrible way to die, but this was especially brutal because it increased the suffering. And when students wanted to kill him, he forbade it. Like, you can't do that. But he did allow them to take the wool away so the fire would reach his heart sooner, because he was going to die at that point. And he was basically as good as dead. But he was as good as dead, like, imminently. Like, he was literally dying. Not terminally ill with projected life. Potentially in 6 months. Like, there's a lot of potentials there. Like, yes, you have a disease. People live with diseases for many, many, many years. And I won't go into too many examples, but I know somebody who's now 30-something and was supposed to die before the age of 2. There's lots of cases like that. And even if it's only 5% of cases, you can't generalize and kill people because of that. If somebody's imminently dying or imminently going to be tortured, then you're allowed to either remove what's the suffering. You can remove the suffering, but you can't actually kill them. Or a person can commit suicide, but you still can't kill the person. So Shaul could have committed suicide himself, but he couldn't have had somebody push him onto the sword. Huge distinction there. And in this case, the doctor... Now I'm adding the doctor. But, meaning, if this is from a Jewish perspective, right? The doctor is absolutely forbidden to do this. I only mentioned the professional side. If this would be legal, then a doctor is bound to that, and they really don't have a choice. And they'd have to do that. They could choose to stop being a doctor. That's a moral choice. But they can't choose not to do that. Right? That's the moral conundrum I talked about. Legally speaking. But you could choose, like, I'm switching professions. You could do that because you're like, I don't want to do this anymore. That's a legitimate moral choice. And maybe doctors will do that. Will choose that. But
And we
if
have
you're
doctors in
legally bound.
We have doctors in our community. Over here.
Yep.
Which is...
Yeah. Well, he does mostly surgeries, but yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah,
It's...
could happen.
A doctor's a doctor.
Uh-huh. So, the point is that that's the only time, meaning there's imminent death and torture by an enemy that's literally going to torture him until he dies. And possibly torture him and torture them and torture them. And even then, you don't have to commit suicide, but that's the only time it is legitimate.
So going to Shaul HaMelech, the fact that he was pushed and asked to be pushed, do we look at that as a suicide, or do we look at that as being killed?
So David HaMelech looks at that as being killed and holds that Amalekite person accountable and kills him.
Correct.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's meaning even though it was a legitimate suicide, because it wasn't an actual suicide. That's where you hold him accountable. Even in a place where it was legitimate for Shaul to take his own life there. And we understand that.
Yes.
And you know, in Japanese culture, you know a lot about Japanese culture. It's karate.
I
Culture.
know a bit about Japanese
More
culture.
than me. You know, in Japanese culture, in war, it's an honor to take your own life.
It's in order
Is
to
it?
preserve your honor.
Right.
So it's similar in the
Meaning
same
in context of war, I mean.
Yeah,
Not in general.
It's similar to the Shaul HaMelech
Yes.
scenario where you don't want to be captured by the enemy,
Right.
in order to be tortured and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's
There's
more
a
honorable.
a good movie. This is slightly on a tangent, but we go on tangents all the time.
With Tom Cruise.
No. With Andrew Garfield, Hacksaw Ridge. It's about World War II, and the American's going to Okinawa, and he's a soldier without a gun.
Oh. It's a bad
And
idea.
he's a medic.
Oh.
Yeah, good movie. You should watch it.
Okay.
But there's
I was thinking of The Last Samurai.
that it also happens in The Last Samurai. There.
Well, The Last Samurai, the spoiler alert is that
If you haven't watched it,
yeah, if you haven't watched
it's
it,
too late.
watch
Filmed
it.
in New Zealand, by the way. They used Mount Taranaki as Mount Fuji
That
in
makes
one of the
sense.
background
That
shots.
makes sense. Yeah. The Last Samurai. There's
My
one of the
movie
scenes
nerd
there.
is coming out.
Yeah, movies in New Zealand. Oh, it's another topic. So, getting back to so there's a case of legitimate suicide. And again, does that happen in regular life? No. Is that a case? Is that a case if somebody's terminally ill? Is there any legitimate a way to commit suicide? No. The answer is no, zero. In Jewish law, that's 100% suicide. How far does it go, by the way? Let's say, in movies, almost when somebody dies, you see them closing their eyes.
Correct.
So according to the Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, closing a person's eyes is murder. Like, you're not even killing them. They're basically dead.
Once the person is dead, if you close the person's eyes, it is murder.
Yeah. They have to close their own eyes.
Interesting.
Like, that's how far
I
it
never
goes.
knew that.
Right.
Yeah.
That's how far it goes. Or the last person's life, you close their eyes and take their last breath. You're killing them. That's murder. Obviously, it's not the same as stabbing somebody to death as far as the level of murder, but it's classified as murder. Now, that's as far as it goes. And at that point, the person is imminently dying. All right. I'll always answer your wife's call at work. I learned that from one of my mentors, Rabbi Aryeh Pomensky. That's when I give you the thing about marriage tips from time to time, almost. Please
I'll
Please
listen
God.
to them
Soon-
back when I hear the podcast every time.
soon in our days. Getting back to murder. So literally closing somebody's eyes is murder. That's as far as it goes. That means definitely mercy killing, euthanasia would be classified as murder. The only exception to this rule, which is really complicated, and we're not going to get into it with the time frame we have now, because I also have to research it again, and there's many opinions about this, is brain death. So the summation of it is that there's two classifications to what is death in Judaism. Is it when the heart stops or even when the brain stops? Everybody agrees when the heart stops, the person is dead, even if their organs are working.
Yeah.
Whether someone is brain dead and the brain stem or the entire brain and their heart is still beating, whether that's actual death, that is highly, 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 highly questionable. Huge halachic debate and a very, very complex topic. The reason it comes up mainly is for organ donation. So meaning, especially if you're on heart transplants, which is 100% legitimate, and you're trying to save someone's life. So in the context of saving someone's life, you can't harvest organs, for lack of a better word. That's what it's called medically. You can't harvest someone's organs if they are alive, because you're killing them. You're not allowed to kill them, even though a person is going to imminently die, right? But if the person is dead, and then you have to classify, is it cardiac arrest? Is it brain death? Can you save the organ? Can you do a transplant or not? And what? Some transplants require a person to be clinically dead in order to take their organs. Some of them you have to be at some point alive or to revive them in order to do heart transplant, lung transplants, things of that nature.
Yeah.
Which are incredibly complex. And again, that's not our subject, but the point is that that is discussed in the context of specifically organ donation, which, if done correctly, is a mitzvah, is a positive commandment. Not that it's an obligation necessarily, but it's saving someone's life, even as that person is dying or dead.
In terms of organ donation, my understanding is that you can't harm yourself in order to save someone else's life, in that sense.
You're not allowed to kill a person. But if somebody wants to donate
meaning
a kidney
I can't decide from today to tomorrow I want to donate my heart right now.
Correct, because then
you'd
be dead.
I'd be dead.
God forbid.
Yeah,
that's right. So yes, correct. The only way to take someone's organs or vital organs, you can donate a kidney. You can donate a kidney and still live.
Yeah.
Right. And that there's a lot of people. There's a movement to do that. There's a whole organization who facilitates that.
Yeah, but that's getting into organ donation a bit too much. So
we are. But the point is that's the context where brain death comes up.
Yeah.
The question is, and here's the real question, and it's just questionable what the answer is, and I don't know if this factors into the New Zealand law specifically. But if someone is clinically brain dead and suffering, and specifically they may no longer be suffering because they're unconscious, they're de facto a vegetable waiting to die,
yeah,
the family may have a huge burden, possibly a financial burden, and for sure just waiting for this person to die if there's almost zero chance that they'll be revived. And at that point, can you pull the plug if you consider them halachically dead? I won't get into if it's yes or no, but that would be the only circumstance where this law could be in effect.
Yeah.
But it's not this exact law, because this exact law,
it's not the same. No.
It's not the same. But that would be the only case where you could say euthanasia or pulling the plug, which is usually the debate. That was the usual debate when I was like a teenager, like 20 years ago. It was all about pulling the plug if you're on a life support machine.
Yeah. The pull the plug or not, and that's quite often can tear families apart, that debate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It can tear families apart. It could also be a tremendous relief for a family instead of going there, seeing their loved one, father, mother, spouse, kid, God forbid, as a vegetable.
Yeah.
And you're like, you know what? They're out of their suffering. We can move on. But families can't move on. It's a huge issue, and there's a lot of factors there, a lot of variables. But what Judaism says is like this. It's a real simple divide. I mean, it's a complicated issue, but halachically, it's pretty simple. You don't have to go onto life support. It's legitimate to choose not to go on life support in order to not have that scenario come up and just die of natural causes and not to be artificially sustained by the life support machine. But once you do on, whether it's a ventilator or dialysis or any other machine, once you go on it, you cannot go off it until you are healed or dead.
Mm.
And then brain dead, that's when brain dead comes up. Is that considered dead or not, as we presented?
Yeah. But there's an interesting nuance there. Because in the situation that we're talking about, life support and brain death or not, that's specifically the life support machine is a part of the scenario. Yes. When we're talking about euthanasia here, it's imminent and ongoing suffering.
From what, though?
Exactly. And from whose perspective?
And what is suffering? So let's get into suffering a little bit. And from whose perspective? Well, the law clearly lays it out as the dying person's suffering.
Correct. So the dying person needs to specifically state that they're suffering.
Correct.
In that sense.
That is 100% correct.
So in the case of the brain death, the person can't state that. They can't.
That's right.
They can't express that sentiment at all.
That's right. The reason I brought it up is not because that's the application of the law, because as you said correctly, it's absolutely not the application of the law. The application of the law is someone who is lucid, who makes a free choice. He's not screaming, writhing in pain. Like, who actually makes a choice. Like, I know I'm suffering. I don't want to suffer anymore. Tells that to the doctor. Signs a lot of things. Is sure about it. Is verified. Is double verified. There's a whole process. Like, New Zealand law doesn't want to try to kill people off to their credit. You know, it's not like God forbid this act is, or this law is literally trying to kill off Kiwis. Like, that's not the, that's not the issue. They're really I mean, it comes from a good place. I do appreciate that the law comes from a place that this person's going to die imminently within 6 months, as we questioned it, but assuming that's the medical diagnosis, which you can question, but they don't take that diagnosis lightly. And a person's suffering, and we 100% believe a person when they say they're suffering, even though we'll get into it. So we believe the person. I'm not questioning that. And we're saying, look, let's just, instead of suffering for the next 6 months or 3 months or 1 month, we don't want you to suffer. Because suffering is bad. That's the claim.
Yeah.
There's a lot of... and it's a worthy thing to say, we don't want you to suffer. We empathize with you. We want to help you and your family. So let's end it now. And they say yes. And they initiate it. So nobody's trying to kill people. It's not like it's a murderous thing and people are going to have blood on their hands and whatnot. So I'm not trying to frame anybody as a murderer. I'm not trying to frame anybody as a bad guy. Nobody's bad in this scenario. The question is this law in accordance with Jewish law or not? That's the discussion.
Yes.
And in Jewish law, it's 100% murder, although it comes from a good place, but it's still murder. And the way to hell is paved with good intentions. So that's basically what we're saying. It's good intentions, though. It's not bad intentions. So we do want to. It's not like murdering somebody in cold blood. So I do want to make that distinction, because somebody listening to this podcast could say, man, you just trashed the government. I did not trash the government.
That's not the purpose of this
correct.
podcast.
I think the government is doing a great job, and I think this is a legitimate conversation. That's why we're having this debate.
Yep.
So, that being said, there's a very interesting presumption to this whole thing. The presumption is suffering is bad. Now, when I spoke about this with a colleague of mine, I won't say who, they told me that I shouldn't go this route because suffering is very personal. But I'm going to go there anyways because it's our podcast. So, is suffering bad?
This is Rabbi Tal's opinion and opinion alone.
That's correct. Is suffering bad? Now, I will tell you that... Well, I mean, Amos, what do you think? I didn't say my opinion yet.
I think suffering is bad, but is sometimes necessary. So I think the consequences of suffering can be either bad or good, because they result in growth in some way, shape, or form. Not in necessarily in the context of euthanasia, but suffering in general.
Right. So there's suffering here and then suffering in general, which brings us back to the first point that we made. That what would be the distinction between this suffering and other sufferings?
Mm.
And one could easily not make a distinction between them. And one could easily make a distinction between them. And the question is, what way is it going to go? More than that, I guess the question I have to you first, Amos, is, do you think someone at the end of their life, let's say you know they're going to die in 6 months, even though what we said is we don't know. But let's say, say a year. It's 3 to 12 months. Let's say it's a year.
Mm-hmm.
And they are suffering. And again, I don't question somebody who says they're suffering. They're suffering. I'm not questioning that. I will never question that. Because you have to believe people. Especially if they say they're suffering. Nobody takes that lightly. Nobody tries to pull somebody's
And as
leg.
we said, suffering is a personal thing. It's a personal.
And suffering is also subjective. What does suffering mean?
Yeah.
You know what? Whatever it means to that person. Let's say they say, for me, it's unbearable suffering. Could be psychological, could be physical. It's obviously a mix of both. Could be emotional. Could be a lot of different components to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we 100% believe anybody who says they are suffering.
Yeah.
So that's not in question. The question is, though, is it inherently a bad thing that we need to stop? Or is it something that if we dig really, really deep, that we can try to mitigate but not stop? Meaning the difference is, as I said before, if you want to give somebody, marijuana, you want to give them morphine, you want to give them help. We don't want people to suffer. I think everybody agrees we don't want people to suffer. Nobody says, let somebody suffer. I'm not going there because that is presumptuous. You don't want anybody to suffer.
No.
I wouldn't want to suffer if I was, God forbid, in that situation. I'd want somebody to help me with it. I just wouldn't want somebody to kill me, to put me out of the suffering. That's the difference. But do you think there's any good thing, I won't even say benefit, but is there any good that comes out of suffering in this specific circumstance, or is it only bad? That's the question.
This is assuming that the person will die in a year.
12 months, yeah.
In 12 months, let's
That's
say.
right.
There might be a good thing for the people around the person.
How is suffering a good thing? So I think this is a really important
So I don't.
point.
Maybe not the suffering is a good thing, but the fact that the person is around for those extra 12 months and it's not, bill passes, the person wants to die, they go through the procedure, they die. You still, as someone who is around the person, gets 12 more months with a loved one. That's a good thing while the person is still suffering. It's a good thing in the perspective of the people around. Whether the person who's suffering themselves, that's a harder question to answer, I think.
It's a very difficult question, but your point is really well taken. I didn't even think about that. The truth is, and the fact is, every single day, the person is alive and well, and you can interact with that person, have closure with that person, just be with that person, is something we can't take away, and it is important, despite the suffering. So you're basically saying, I want to alleviate all suffering, but it doesn't justify shortening this person's life by our own actions.
Yes.
Because, they'll die anyways. They'll die however they die. We'll try to give them morphine, all that stuff, make them comfortable. That's all good.
Yeah.
As we said, marijuana, whatever is good for that person. But have that time with them, because that time's never going to come back.
Yes.
And that time's precious. But the question is, there's a whole sugya about suffering. And again, this is you got to dig really, really deep for this one. And you have to think a little bit dispassionately about this. So if you have a loved one who's gone through this, and I've had grandparents, I said, who've gone through suffering. and again, we don't want people to suffer. The Torah doesn't say suffering. But the Torah does, the Talmud comments, there's like 2 full pages of Talmud, in Masechet Brachot, the tractate of Brachot, the first tractate in the Talmud. And one of the first things it discusses is suffering, in fact. And basically it says like this. There's different types of suffering, which I won't get into. And suffering brings you more reward, at least in the next world, and alleviates sins in this world. That being said, all the rabbis said, I don't want suffering and I don't want their reward, which is a really interesting thing. It goes through like all the benefits, if you will, the spiritual benefits of suffering. And then all the rabbis said, I don't want suffering in this world. I'd rather have less of a reward and less suffering. So that's our take on it. However, you can't discount the fact that suffering has spiritual benefit to it. The point I'm making is that, yes, you don't want suffering. Yes, we need to do everything in our power to minimize suffering in this world, but it does not legitimize taking a person's life. That's the point I'm making. Because there is a benefit to suffering. Now, listen, people are going to hear this, and people are going to be really pissed off. I mean, I may have made you really angry in our first podcast.
What a first episode.
I really don't care, because this is my opinion. And also, you just have to dig deep. You really got to dig deep and think about, does suffering, which again we believe somebody, does that legitimize murder? You got to sit with that. It's not a simple thing.
No, it's not.
And who says that we have the choice to tell somebody to put someone out of their misery? If they're not brain dead, because brain dead could be halachically dead. Outside of that, that's why I brought it up. If somebody's brain dead and they're a specific type of brain dead, and you hold by the opinion that they're halachically dead, then you pull the plug. You're not killing them because they're effectively dead from a Jewish law standpoint. And therefore, if their heart is still beating, they could be halachically dead. Right? But that's a lot of assumptions, and it depends on what opinion you hold. That's the only case where you can literally kill a person because it's not actually killing them by definition. Because they're already dead. For a point of Jewish law, even though medically they may or may not be considered clinically dead. But here, person's 100% alive. You talk to the person, they're talking. The time won't come back with them.
Yeah.
And you want to put them out of your suffering, but it's so presumptuous. I think it's so presumptuous of us to say we want to put this person, or even a person says, I want to put myself out of suffering. Who are you to put yourself out of suffering by dying?
Yeah.
And I'll leave with one point, at least my last word, and then I'll give you the last word on the podcast. My last word is that, again, quoting my father, Dr. David Tal, who's I also listen to his medical opinion, at least sometimes. But in these matters, not really for my own medical opinions, because I actually do the opposite of what he says usually. But in this matter, is he said something really smart that I never really thought of. And I'm a rabbi, he's a doctor, but he said something really smart. He said, from a spiritual perspective, it is not our. We don't have control over our own life. Our life, our neshama belongs to Hashem, belongs to God. It doesn't belong to us. We cannot make the choice to kill ourselves.
Correct. I agree with that.
It's a huge point, by the way, which I could have started with, but I wanted to end with.
No, that's a really good point to end with. Because I did want to ask you, because when you said that you wanted to speak on the topic, because we talked about the point of this allows a person to sort of play God with a person's neshama.
That's right. And I think that once we start playing God, the consequences and the unintended consequences of this are going to be devastating to this society. Because once we play God here, we can always expand that and play God other places. And who says we won't play God when someone we think, they say, I can't live anymore, but they're not terminally dying, but they're psychologically damaged. who says we don't play God and get to, even though it's really extreme, we get to Nazism where they say these people can't live. I mean, you could tell me that that's a huge jump, which it is, but it's also not that huge of a jump if you start playing God. Yeah. So just to end up this conversation, if we get to play God, that is extremely, extremely dangerous. It's a slippery slope. And you can say a lot of things are a slippery slope, but this one really is. Because the fact is, who's to say if somebody's terminally ill for 6 months, what's the difference between that and 12 months, 2 years, 5 years? What's the actual difference if a person is suffering? There's really no end to it.
I fully agree with that statement. And I think we'll finish with that. So, thank you for listening, whoever you are, wherever you might be in the world. Please like, subscribe, and all that other good stuff. Leave a comment. Let us know what you think. And bear in mind that this is our opinion and what we feel about this particular referendum that's coming up very, very soon. Please vote, whether you vote this way or that, and form your own opinion.
Please go and vote. It's a really important issue. I can't vote because I'm on a visa here, so I don't have voting rights yet. But have what to say. And again, this opinion represents my personal opinion. Amos' opinion reflects his personal opinion. We don't represent any organization in our opinion. The next topic is going to be the advantages of living in a small Jewish community versus a large Jewish community. Many, many advantages to it. And Wellington, we're about 2,000 Jews, more or less, in general, in the entire Wellington area. We'll discuss that, the regional Jewish community we have, and small Jewish communities, the advantages we have, and large Jewish communities where you could get lost in the fray. That's a teaser for next time.
We'll see you all, or you'll hear us next week.
Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Bye-bye. Chag Sameach.